Hi, Daniel.
Hi, Bob.
How you doing?
Good. How are you?
I'm doing okay. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright. This is the Wright Show, available on both streaming video and audio podcasts. You are D.T. Max, staff writer for The New Yorker, and also author of Every Love Story is a Ghost Story, A Life of David Foster Wallace. And we're here to talk about David Foster Wallace's life, but also in particular his philosophy of life. Let me explain to our viewers and listeners how we wound up talking. The precipitating event was the movie The End of the Tour, a biopic about Wallace. I was urged to see it by my daughter, even though I had not read really anything by him. I saw it. I got very interested in it, in him, and started reading up on him, reading some of his essays, and I watched his very famous viral commencement speech at Kenyon College called This Is Water on YouTube. So I thought that, of course, one approach would have been to plow through his oeuvre and, invest the next year in reading his magnum opus Infinite Jest, which is over 1,000 pages. But a shortcut would be to talk to someone who's done that and indeed has studied the whole life of David Foster Wallace, and that's you. So thanks for saving me all that time. Although I'm sure I would have liked
Also, a great pleasure.
I'm sure I would have liked his book.
Yeah.
So first of all, what got you interested in him? I assume, of course, he committed suicide about 7 years ago or so, but I assume you were interested in him before that happened?
I was, although as I always, tell people, I wasn't, there's a core of David Foster Wallace people, just intense readers. I was not one of those readers. I mean, I had read him. I did not know him. We knew of each other, but we did not actually know each other. And I was, when he died, it's 2008 and September 12th, I was as surprised as anyone because like most people, even people who've been big readers of Infinite Jest, his great novel, I had lost interest in him, but I certainly wasn't looking for news from him day to day.
Mm-hmm.
At that point, it comes back down to my work at The New Yorker. The editor of The New Yorker, David Remnick, suggested I write something on Wallace. And so this whole journey actually began as an assignment. It really began as why don't you go and check this out? And I did the piece. It was long, about 10,000 words. And I had this deep feeling that, I didn't want to leave him behind. And I wasn't ready to go on to other stuff. Long pieces in journalism, they're like, they're relationships and they're not marriages. And so they have that ending just when you're getting to know the other person or the subject. And in this case, I wanted more. And so I was partially, it's funny you say I'm saving you the work of reading the books, but actually I phrase it a little bit differently, which is, I'm preventing you from the pleasure of reading the books. And hopefully afterward, when we're done talking, you'll go off to your indie bookstore and pick up Infinite Jest or at least a wonderful essay collection called A Supposedly Fun Thing I'll Never Do Again, which is a great place to start with Wallace. But anyway, I wanted to spend the year reading Wallace again. And there really weren't that many ways that I could credibly spend a year reading Wallace again unless I wrote a biography. Mm-hmm. So I got going.
And was there any one thing that particularly drew you into him or any kind of mystery you wanted to solve, question about him you wanted to answer?
Absolutely. I mean, there's two things. One, even when I wrote the magazine article, the New Yorker piece, I understood that that David Foster Wallace had a really exceptional relationship to literature and writing. It was pretty clear to me that at the end of his life, so the story about what happens to David, and it's incredibly sad, is that he goes off of an antidepressant. He had lifelong, profound depression. And he writes about it.
He had been on a kind of suicide watch much earlier in his life, right?
Number of different times. Yeah. Number of different times he attempted suicide. So he goes off of this antidepressant, and there's a little bit of a question about why, but I'm pretty convinced he went off of it because he couldn't write the way he wanted to write. Mm-hmm. He'd written Infinite Jest. Every writer who writes a stunningly successful book has that weight on their shoulders, and he had it on his shoulders and then some. So that was part of it. And the other part was, the thing about David that really, really interested me was that he didn't live life, shall we say, like an ordinary writer or an ordinary citizen or an ordinary modern American. Especially in his later years, he was sort of obsessed with the desire, the hope of finding a meaning what he was doing, a deeper meaning. So, for instance, there's a scene in the movie End of the Tour, which is actually doesn't really happen, where most of the movie is verbatim from David Lipsky's book. Mm-hmm. But there's a moment where he says, "Be a good person" to David Lipsky, or something like that.
Yeah, be a good guy.
Be a good guy, something like that. And that actually isn't what he said, but it is a proper distillation of what he was after at that point, and there's no question about that.
Huh. Yeah, that was the scene where he was feeling jealousy toward David Lipsky, the journalist who actually interviewed him, because there was an old flame of Wallace's present. And
is that when it takes place? I just remember. Yeah. Anyway.
Yeah. So now an interesting thing about this movie is it is, I think as biopics go, I mean, you're right, some stuff is made up. As biopics go, it's probably more reliable than average because the journalist, David Lipsky, who went down to write a piece about Wallace for Rolling Stone, taped everything, and most of the movie is conversation between him and Wallace, and I think most of it is pretty close to verbatim. And so it's interesting in that regard.
Sorry, Robert. I mean, I think, when you write biography, and it's a kind of biography movie, but just thinking about what I did, so I wasn't able to interview Wallace since he was dead, but the way I got close to him was through his letters. I had an enormous quantity of letters that his friends. One of the weird things about letters is when you send me a letter, you own the expression, but I have the letter. Mm-hmm. So after Wallace died, all his friends, I was quite surprised actually, but they all said, look at these letters he wrote to me. And so, and I was able to use them in the book. And so I felt like, as you examined that kind of question, like what did David Foster Wallace, what was he doing? What did he want? What was he seeking? Especially again, I mean, his early years are different, but he goes through this middle passage in his life where he basically checks in for addiction to McLean, the Harvard-associated hospital. And after that, I mean, partially through the sort of tenets of the 12-step program he's a part of, but also because I think he's always looking in that direction, he begins, a fairly consistent attempt to find meaning in his life. And the famous Kenyon College speech, mm-hmm. Is probably, I mean, he had mixed feelings about that speech. But it is, it's called This Is Water, and it is about trying to maintain a kind of alertness in your own life. The central sort of joke in the speech, which apparently comes from 12-step programs, is that these two young fish are walking down the street, ignore that, right? These two young fish are walking down the street, and an old fish comes by, and the old fish says to them, how's the water, boys? Old fish continues walking down the street, and one young fish says to the other, what's water? Mm-hmm. The idea being it's so present in your life you don't even notice what you're doing and who you are.
Right.
So I think that's not a bad, I mean, he didn't make that up, but not a bad way to look at what he was after in his later years.
Meaning, well, you've said a couple of things. You've emphasized his be a good guy line, or that line, whether he actually said that exactly or not. And then now you're talking about kind of an alertness to, it's kind of like, mindfulness, as we say these days. I mean, that's part of what he's getting at in that Kenyon talk.
When he was doing it, it was mindfulness. I mean, he wasn't, we're talking about 1996 till his death in 2008. He's not the only person interested in this kind of thing by any stretch of the imagination. That's kind of a Buddhism.
Right. There is that vibe strongly.
He dips into Christianity to see if that will provide it. A lot of it's just, let's almost call it kind of Quakerish decency world. And he's somewhat drawn to kind of Mennonite, at least to people who are Mennonites. I don't think he really personally had... I don't think he found his church, if you exclude his 12-step program, which was, I think properly speaking, was a church. In fact, often met in the basement of the church.
Yeah.
But he did try beyond that. There's all these ideas in 12-step programs like paying it forward. If you do a good deed will be done to you, that kind of thing. And I think it was a kind of a homegrown decency that he was pursuing to some extent. Not a theology, not a teleology, really.
Although I mean, first of all, he flirts a lot in his writing and utterances with notions of God, the divine, the sacred, and so on. And I gather that in 12-step programs, there's an emphasis, not an insistence that you be a Christian or something, but an emphasis on believing in some sense in a higher power and turning your life over to it. And my daughter tells me that in Infinite Jest, there's kind of emphasis on the pragmatic value, or maybe I think she said there's an emphasis on pragmatic value of that, leaving aside the truth of the belief.
Yeah, I think that's, sure. I think, frankly, a lot of people are agnostic or whatever, going to these 12-step programs, and they find out that they're supposed to pledge their lives to a higher power. And they're like, well, what higher power? And there's a lot of ways, I'm certainly not an expert on 12-step programs, there's a lot of ways that people sort of deal with that. I think, if I remember right, and it's been a while since I read Every Love Story is a Ghost Story, but I think Good Orderly Direction or something like that is one of the sort of acronyms that you can use for God. Perhaps it is slightly wrong. But the idea being you can substitute other non-theological ideas for God. Just ways that make human life more directed or more decent or more caring. And I think that was really, I don't think he ever totally settled on it, to tell you the truth. Right. I think many people don't. People are always looking for clarity in David's ideas, and I think that's fine. We all look for clarity in everything.
Yeah.
I never have found immense clarity in his ideas, these big ideas for David. Buddhism was never, he was certainly interested in it. He did sitting, but what I call him, I had a wonderful correspondence in Every Love Story between him and a Buddhist, a practicing Buddhist, and he keeps saying, should I sit? Is sitting better? Should I feel pain? How much pain? And the guy just sort of writes him back eventually and says, honestly, just do it. Just do what feels right, and it'll be good enough.
Did he stick with that?
Yeah, he did. I as far as I know, that was kind of a long-term, ongoing project of his for all of his later life.
Yeah, because his This Is Water talk, it's not just kind of mindfulness in a superficial sense, meaning pay attention to the here and now, stop and smell the roses. There's a kind of a deeper thing he's saying, which is also arguably more deeply and authentically Buddhist than that, which is that every perception you have about the world almost is a judgment you're imposing on it. It's a story you're making up about it. So he goes through this he says, he's talking to these graduates, he says, like it or not, your life is going to be full of drudgery. You're going to, at the end of a workday, go to a supermarket, you're stressed out, there's these annoying people in line that may strike you as grotesque, and on and on and on, and you drive home and there's some guy in a gas-guzzling SUV and so on. And he says, and he really is subtle in the sense that he's not saying your negative judgments of these people are false. He's explicit in not even saying that. He says, the point is, it's a choice. I'm not going to tell you which is the valid interpretation. It's a choice, the meaning you assign to everything in your life. That's really, really Buddhist, even in a, I think, kind of ancient sense.
I suspect you know more about Buddhism than I do. I mostly met it through Wallace, but I think that's an interesting point. Probably correct. He read Buddhist teaching. He read everything. He was a omnivore, and was always somewhat desperate, I think, in his searching for information. He was so uncomfortable through his whole life. Imagine that you're so uncomfortable that no minute feels entirely satisfactory. Well, you're always going to be looking for the thing that's going to make it all feel better. And I think even when David was happy, and even when he was on this antidepressant successfully, I don't think he ever felt, super well. I don't think that was a part of his personality at that point.
Yeah. And I have to think that that advice, that noting that it's your choice how you interpret things, that is, in some sense, must have been the story of his struggle to stay sane and not too depressed, right? That somebody prone to depression, he often had these days where everything seemed grim and grotesque, and he was clearly aware that at some level that's not true, but it's a struggle.
I'm sorry, but the only thing I would say maybe doesn't quite sound right in that, Bob, is that I think his depression was not look, depression is a million different animals, right? And I think there are kinds of depression where you can kind of choose to some extent, not your way out of the depression, but some way to ameliorate the depression. I think that's probably true. I don't think he had that kind of depression. I mean, I think he had the kind of depression that you either treat medically or you don't. So I actually suspect more that when he talks about choosing, he's really talking about, I mean, maybe this is connected, but he's sort of talking about his addictions, I think, more than he's talking about his depression there. And he's talking about why you can kind of, look, if you look at AA and other 12-step programs, they emphasize, I think, again and again, the will. I mean, they're really programs about the will. There's no medicine behind AA. I mean, it's a program about having the will to change your behavior. And so I think that's very important when he's talking about what you pay attention to in the supermarket. I'll say one other thing, which is, what's I think funny and weird about that whole speech is that for some people it's an extremely obvious point. It's really quite interesting. You say that to some people, they're like, yeah, well, obviously, right? I find that for younger people, especially students, it remains revelatory. That it's really interesting how maybe it's because they don't spend a lot of time in the supermarket. I don't really know, but they really get what that means. Whereas for some people, it's like, well, obviously you have to choose what you pay attention to. Some people do cross sticks in the.
People say it, but living it is very hard. They say it, and then.
Of course. 1
minute later, they're outraged about some grievance without realizing that that's just a totally self-centered. They're just it's very hard to live it. And the point on depression, it's not that this alone could have saved him or could have even kept him stable enough to write during the years when he was productive, but it's more that, like, as you said, even on the medication, he had to struggle. And also, there are gradations of depression that any depressive goes through. I'm guessing, that there must have been times when he tried to put this advice to use himself, especially if he was under the guidance of a kind of a Buddhist instructor of a mindfulness bent.
But I think he tried it every day. I mean, I think that the reason that the Kenyon College address is significant, I think, there's two reasons. One, I think the expression is very strong. I mean, it's really quite a remarkable speech. Some people think it's kind of mawkish. I don't agree. I think it's very courage in going into mawkishness is what makes it powerful. And then, the other thing is the person delivering it. I mean, you sense, and there's an audio tape you can hear online. I mean, you sense that this person is, knows what they're talking about and has been through this experience. It's really quite a remarkable talk to hear, and it's also published as a little book, but I do think hearing it online is unusual and special. He tried it every day. I mean, I think that's unquestionable. I think he probably tried somewhat different combinations of it every day. And David was not. I mean, later years, his very last years aside, he was not really. Even in the period where that movie takes place, I mean, he's not the happiest guy during that time, and he doesn't actually have everything under control in 1996, which is when Infinite Jest is published. I mean, he's struggling day to day. Only really about last year of his life, paradoxically, before he commits suicide, would you call him really in a good place. I mean, he's in a creative place, I think, during those years, around the time of Infinite Jest, which is the mid-'90s, but not a good place, not a safe or happy place, really.
So you're saying he was in a good place after he gave up the medication? For a while he was in a good place?
I think it's the medication, no. The chronology is no. So he's in Illinois. He writes Infinite Jest. He moves to Illinois, gets a teaching gig at Illinois State University, and he's there. I'm trying to remember from every love story, but he's there. Maybe it's 7 years or so, maybe 6 years. So those are kind of tempestuous years, difficult years. Then he moves to Pomona, gets a job at Pomona College. I think it's 2002, 2003. And those are very happy years until he goes off the medication in, I believe it's early 2007. I'd have to look it up. So there's 4 years, and he meets his wife during that time, and they marry, and so on. So there's this dreadful coda to his life. There's this dreadful year, 9 months, whatever it is, when he is off the medication and really suffering. I'm not talking about that. time. But during and as a biographer, I mean, to be honest, it's the years of tumult are often more, they make you a more vigorous writer because so much is going on. So his time in Illinois, at Illinois State, was terrifically interesting to write about. And he wrote amazing letters as he struggled to try and sort of put into action just the kind of things that we're now talking about. And there's some letters that I quote in every love story where he, talks about how, for instance, he had a definite, you want to call it sex addiction. I don't know what the exact term would be, but he certainly was having a lot of trouble trying to be a decent person with women. And there's, for instance, an adage or a rule in 12-step programs, that you don't date other members of the 12-step programs. It's called 13 stepping, and he violated that rule relentlessly and was really angry at himself for it, and wrote some letters where he talks about how angry he is about it, but he can't seem to help it. So it's an ongoing project during that period. I mean, his quote, his goodness, whatever you want to call it, it's a work in progress. He wouldn't be an interesting story for me as a writer if it hadn't been a work in progress.
So, I mean, not to trivialize his problems, but sheer impulse control was a big problem.
Yeah, I mean, is that impulse or learned behavior? In his case, I'm not entirely sure. I would say that it's some combination of.
I'm thinking about a few things. I mean, the drug addiction, and what was it? I think he denied that it was.
He's not. Bob. He's totally. I mean, he's not. He does not, as far as I know, fall off the wagon ever from when he goes into rehab in fall of 1989. Until his death. As far as I know, I mean, you don't know everything as a biographer, but I've never heard that he had fallen off the wagon.
And that was it. It had been mainly alcohol and what, pain relievers, or
been pot, really. Been pot. He talks about. I mean, he goes to Yaddo, the literary colony, and he claims he couldn't find any pot, so he's with Jay McInerney, the novelist, and they start drinking heavily. I don't know. Sometimes you believe things a little too readily. The idea that you could not find pot at Yaddo strikes me as highly unlikely. All the same, that was the story. And so he did, being a binger, even in his writing a kind of binger, he gets too deep into alcohol. But I don't think it's ever his primary drug or drug of choice.
One thing that I think kind of saves the "this is water talk" from cliche is his insistence that he's aware that it's largely cliched. In other words, he keeps saying, now I know this sounds like cliche, and it's part of a broader thing about him, I think, which is this, that he was very self-conscious, aware of what was going on with him. He was very aware of social dynamics, and he's one of these people who had trouble playing the game where you, don't talk about the social dynamics. I mean, it's in the movie, and I suspect this part is on the transcript, it's like a situation where a journalist is coming to profile him for Rolling Stone. Now, normally, when a journalist does that, both parties know, okay, I have this discretion in how I'm going to portray you. It's, meanwhile, you're thinking about how you're going to be portrayed, and you're trying to shape the way I portray you, and there's this political game going on, blah, blah, blah. Normally, people don't talk about it, right. But he insisted on talking about it, and I'm wondering if that was a more pervasive theme in his life, so far as you could tell.
Yeah, well, certainly, I mean, he talks in an essay about having this kind of issue with what he calls the U.S. game of appearance poker. I think that's his phrase, the U.S. game of appearance poker, something like that. And he's always, he's a guy who is very aware of false fronts, and he's very aware, even if you look at his early fiction, he's very aware of the kind of, his first forays into fiction tend to be kind of postmodernist, and they tend to be the kind of fiction that John Barth wrote, writes, where, you see the sort of struts that hold up the fiction. You're told again and again, this is a story being told you in words. These are not real people actually doing these things. It's the kind of thing we tend to forget, or want to forget even as fiction readers. It's what we love to forget. And so I think similarly in his life, when he would go to a party, if the, for instance, if the everyone was dancing, he could, never quite get past how weird they all looked on the dance floor. And he once said to his friend Corey, watching a group of kids dancing at Amherst, where he was an undergraduate, he said, imagine that if there was no music, just the crazy gestures and the awkwardness. So, yeah, it's a part of him, it's a part of him to think those things, and it's a part of him to say those things. I think he had it under fairly complicated control most of his life. He's not the kind of, he wanted to be cool. I mean, I don't think we should ever forget.
Well, and he was aware of that, and he was intermittently honest about it, I think. I mean, that's what I mean. It's like it was hard for him to play the game without talking about the game. And in fact, he said, I think, when he was a very good tennis player as a teenager, I think he said that something like, self-consciousness is what kept him from being a better tennis player.
Mm-hmm. Self-consciousness and this kind of feedback loop where you're self-conscious and then you're aware of that self-consciousness and it makes you more self-conscious was a huge part of, you might call the kind of sort of superstructure of his depression. I don't think it was the depression, but it was an outcome of it. I think very common actually in depression. He was very aware always of that kind of circular, the classic David Foster Wallace kind of circular thing is, okay, I'm going to be nice to you because I should be nice to you. But if I'm nice to you, isn't that really just manipulating you so that you like me? And if I think that, does that mean that actually I'm a better person because at least I'm aware that I'm trying to manipulate you, so I won't try to manipulate you? Or am I just a clever kind of manipulator because I know how to both see it and sort of see it from a meta level? That's the standard, Wallace conundrum that comes up again and again in his fiction and in his life. And in his letters, too. I mean, there are letters in every love story. There are these wonderful set of letters to Elizabeth Wurtzel, the writer, where he talks exactly in those terms.
Yeah. No, I think, my sense has always been that in whole categories of accomplishment, maybe sports, but like, corporate power and everything, the most successful people are the least self-conscious people, like the least self-aware people. Like, there are some very successful people who are not self-aware at all. And I think he illustrates, the inefficiency and worse that could come from too much self-consciousness.
I think that's right. He's mixed feelings, as everybody who's extremely self-conscious does, I think. But who's successful, he had mixed feelings about it. I think he often wished, he wrote a couple of pieces about tennis stars. And he was very, very, and there's a character like this also in Infinite Jest. He was very interested in people who don't have that second or third layer of thinking, who just do. The sort of, it's sort of Fortinbras versus Hamlet in Hamlet. So he loves to be with them. But, his own strength as a writer obviously comes out of not being those people. And I think he's got to be aware. I mean, look, David was never happy with himself, but I find it hard to believe there weren't moments when he realized that his creativity also came out of this pain, at times just kind of almost like having a weight on your shoulders that you can't, just proceed in a forthright way, that you have to look at it again and again from different angles and from different reasons. And the other thing, Bob, is that he was also aware of his charm. I mean, it's complicated, this sort of Saint Dave image that floats around. I love David. I didn't know him, but I loved him when I wrote about him. But I always thought of him as being a very interestingly flawed saint. And I thought that was what made him exciting to both write about and read about. If he had been somebody who had simply easily transitioned from a kind of profane youth to, some sort of secular perfection, I don't know that I would have been particularly drawn to him. I mean, I often think of the example of Thomas Merton. I don't know that much about Thomas Merton, but I've often felt in reading Merton that the stuff I like is the early stuff. That when he begins to sort of be a more, almost entirely spiritual person, I don't feel the vibrancy in his writing anymore. But the early sections, I'm thinking of, what is it? It's called Seven Story Mountain. Is that the?
I think so.
Yeah, so the first, 3, 4, 5 chapters are stunning, and they're all about being the guy he doesn't like anymore. But that's where the energy and the power of the story is. Maybe that's just me. I mean, there may be people who read hagiographies and find them, exemplary and in that way satisfactory. I've never been that person. I like the stride. David and I think I show this in every love story, I like the struggle. I crave the fact that every day it's hard for him.
Yeah.
That he has these goals. He never forgets these goals.
Yeah.
Never forgets them. And
what are the goals? You mean daily output goals, or
I wasn't thinking of that. Yeah, the whole writing side of it. That's separate. Not separate, but we're not really talking about that right now. We're talking about the goal of whatever he says in that moment in the movie, like be a good human being, like that part of it. And that's really what. I mean, David's fame rests on a number of, I think, props at this point. And one is certainly the thing we're talking about, which is for a lot of people who haven't read him, I mean, and most people have not read him, maybe they've listened to the This Is Water speech on the internet, maybe they've read my biography, I don't know, but they're not deep into his work.
Yeah.
And Infinite Jest is a long book, in some ways a hard book, well, not that hard, but not easy. And so for them, it's really this aura of struggle, this goal, which I think, you don't have to have his biography to relate to it. I think more people can relate to it than not.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you mentioned that he wrote about tennis players. A pretty famous essay was the Roger Federer's religious experience, which appeared in the New York Times. And a couple of things struck me. One is that it was just really illuminating about tennis, and part of that was that he knew tennis, but he also, it seemed to me, he demonstrated a really good analytical mind. He really broke it down, like the ingredients of the success of Federer and what had changed in the game as a result of change in the racket. So there was that, and of course he majored in philosophy at Amherst, and I think was hailed by some of his professors as having the kind of mind that could have turned you into a successful philosopher. The other thing was the religious experience. He did kind of deliver on that part of the title. Interestingly, I think the climax of that kind of comes in a footnote. He was prone to footnotes, but I just wanted to read this thing. I mean, I think a bus driver, somebody had prepped him by saying when he got off the bus or something to go see Federer, he said it's like a religious experience watching him play. So he was attuned to that. But then he writes, there's a reference to a sick child earlier in the essay, and then he says, but the truth is that whatever deity, entity, energy, or random genetic flux produces sick children also produced Roger Federer. And just look at him down there. Look at that. And he says, I mean, that's the religious experience. I mean...
Yeah, I'd forgotten that. That's terrific.
Yeah. Now, were you going to say something in response to the point about his analytical mind? Or
No, I agree with you. I mean, he was considered an exceptional analytic philosopher. I mean, he was mostly interested in language. His thesis wasn't really about, is free will possible? Although it would appear to be about that. It's really about grammatical structures and what they constrain and what they permit. Mm-hmm. I think he rightly, I think he's a junior at Amherst, he decides this is sort of a dry well, that it's clever and it's giving him a kind of pleasure, but that there's obviously something not happening. Remember, we haven't said this, but David is a child of academic parents. His father is a professor of philosophy at the University of Illinois, Champaign-Urbana, and his mother's a very, very skillful community college English teacher. She wins a teaching award. She's a terrific teacher from everything I've heard. And so he comes from an academic background. I think his first instinct had been, I'll be an academic. There's this wonderful practical side of David that I often like to surprise people with, because he's become kind of the Luftmensch for our times. But actually, one of the reasons he wanted to be a teacher wasn't, despite it turns out being a very good teacher, was that he wanted the insurance. He already knew that he was going to rack up some significant health bills with his mind, and he knew enough that he needed insurance, that he could not be one of these writers who goes up to a cabin in Vermont and produces a great work. I mean, a lot of other reasons why that wouldn't have been the right choice for him, but on a practical level, he really needed structures, and he needed a payer. He needed a payer.
Uh-huh. Now, in the movie, there's a scene at the end where he's like dancing at some church. Did that really happen? I mean, you mentioned he was.
It's not my impression. Look, I haven't fact checked.
Okay.
I don't think David was a person who was, in my reading of the letters and his comments too self-conscious to throw himself
That was why I asked.
on a dance floor. And I think people have written about that. But, you know, I mean, look, a life is complicated. You could say, you know, Bob Wright was famous for never, ever, ever eating Brussels sprouts. Oh, we know Bob Wright, never Brussels sprouts guy. And yet, you know, let's say someone writes a biography and you're like, well, you know, in 1994 we had this celebratory dinner and they passed the Brussels sprouts and he ate the Brussels sprouts. So the biography, like, well, you know, that's impossible. Bob Wright would never, but that doesn't change a person. My guess is not, but, you know, could it be? Could he have had a moment of, you know, I mean, we are ourselves every moment of the day, but we're not always entirely ourselves to the same intensity. None of us are. It's one of the things I think about all the time with David. And, you know, there are moments, I think, where David Foster Wallace is, you know, just a guy sitting around and look, he liked to listen to sports radio. There's a wonderful description he gives in the piece on 9/11 that he wrote, The View from Mrs. Thompson's. It's a terrific piece and a very strange one. I think one of the best pieces about 9/11, worth reading. It's just about being in, you know, Bloomington, Illinois, you know, on the day when the attacks occur and watching it on TV. I think some of it's probably not real. It has a fictional flavor, although it's slugged as nonfiction, and I suspect some of it is fictionalized. But anyway, there's he says that the news of the attacks reached him was when he was taking a shower and listening to the Chicago sports radio. You know, and like for a lot of people, I think they'd be like, that's like, why, you know, look, we read your biography, Daniel, and there's not much about him having an ongoing interest in sports. In fact, there's nothing after, I mean, there's tennis, but, you know, tennis is a little different than football. And so what's that about? It's like, the truth is, you know, I mean, I think a good biography doesn't try to integrate every single gesture of life. Could I make you an argument for why he was interested in sports? Could I say he was trying to be a regular guy, but he was also sort of thinking about how being a regular guy was a self-conscious decision? Yeah, I can make that argument. But it may also just be that, you know, sitting in the shower, killing time, getting ready for class, you know, not really wanting to hear the heavy news of the day, and he turned to sports. You know, who was it who said that? Could it have been? I'm trying to think who it was, but anyway, some Harvard professor said that the sign of a well-adjusted man was that he turned to the sports section first. I want to say it was Stanley Cavell because that would fit so perfectly into all of the things that interested David, and he had a kind of obsession with Stanley Cavell. But anyway, as David says in the Federer article, you know, go ahead, Google it, knock yourself out. I got it wrong.
So you mentioned 9/11. I came across a video of him being interviewed kind of about American foreign policy sometime after that. And he kind of, I was happy to see him more or less share my view of things, which involved emphasizing that there was a real danger that the American response to 9/11 was going to make the problem worse. And that in turn involved, and I think he was explicit about this, understanding how things looked to people abroad when you do things like invade their countries. It's like we take it for granted, we're the good power, everything we're doing is good. People around the world don't share that view. Now that's also a theme in the This Is Water address. He starts out, before he gets to the point that your interpretation of everyone and everything is just an interpretation, he asks you to look at things from the point of view of the person you're judging negatively. Maybe the person who just cut you off in traffic, you know, had this kind of day or has this kind of problem and so on. I'm wondering, did you, and I'm like a big fan of like looking at things from the point of view of other people, as many people are, but was this a big theme in his life or work? Or
the theme being what? That you should
the importance of doing the work to look at things from the point of view of other people.
Well, I mean, I think it would be a big heading under projects. You know, for David, I think he was not naturally good at this, and so it becomes one of these central projects that he has. And again, it comes out of 12-step programs. I think it comes out of, you know, the idea that he has. I mean, in his early years, when he looks back on his early years, which is different than living them, but when he looks back on them, he's sort of convinced that he was, as he describes his behavior. He did a graduate writing degree at the University of Arizona, and he had some famous sort of dust-ups with the faculty, and the sort of usual interpretation, which is valid, is that, you know, David was just so brilliant in going on his own path that there was really nothing anyone could teach him. I mean, you could guide him, you could praise him, but you couldn't really teach him in the conventional sense. So, you know, if you had said that to David when he was actually a young man at Arizona, he'd have agreed with that. But by the time he's older, you know, his big point, well, when people would ask him about that, he'd say, well, actually, you know, the truth is I was a prick. So...
Weren't we all?
Right. Well, sure. Many of David's, you know, again and again, I say, like, what's unusual about David, there's many things. One is the intensity of the commitment to the solutions to problems that we all experience. Another thing is he's a genius. I mean, the brain and the actions of the brain are just remarkable. But my point being, yeah, he does, you know, he is on a project, sometimes even periodically committed to it, and I think he would acknowledge this, to be more open to how other people see the things that he's so certain that he's seeing the right way. And that's a progressive and kind of a lifelong project for him. I hadn't really thought about the 9/11 piece from that point of view. What I remember most from his 9/11 piece is a couple things. One, he's trying to find an American flag for his lawn, and he can't figure out where everybody else got their American flags. And it's a wonderful moment. I mean, it's played for laughs. But the serious idea there, which I think is interesting, is, you know, that he's still not really the group animal that some piece of him would like to be, or is suspicious about being, or at least recognizes as a possible way of being. Because remember, he's in the Midwest, and although I've gotten some flack for this from people from the Midwest, I think one reason he chooses the Midwest is because it's, you know, it's for him at any rate a simpler code to read. The behavior of people in Bloomington it's simpler than the behavior of people in Manhattan or Boston or any northeastern, you know, redoubt or big academic town. Like, it's just easier to decode the codes. And one of the prominent codes in Bloomington is patriotism. And he, you know, admires it, endorses it, also suspicious of it. You know, he wasn't primarily a political guy. I think if you want to look at David's politics, really, as a mature person, you want to look at his piece on John McCain, which is really about authenticity in politics, and really about, is it possible to be authentic, or so John McCain, during his first campaign, you know, he was on the Straight Talk Express, and he seemed to be saying things nobody would say. To be honest, I can't remember a single one, but definitely he gave off a...
Yeah, that was his shtick. Yeah.
Well,
I would have thought that David Foster Wallace would have seen it as a shtick. But you tell me, what position?
No, I don't think he does. I mean, I write about this very extensively in every love story. I don't think he knows. I mean, I think actually he doesn't definitively conclude, but I do think he respects McCain. You know, the way that you do tend to respect someone whose experience is so different from your own. That he's a war hero, he's a prisoner of war. I think for David, he's always thinking, could I have done those things? But he doesn't think it's just a marketing tool. I don't think that this piece admits of the idea that he thinks McCain is just a higher, you know, so with David, there's like the first order insincere person. And then even worse is the second order inauthentic person who's trying to appear authentic to manipulate you. And so for him, I don't think he thinks McCain is, you know, a person who's being trickily, falsely authentic. I think he thinks there's authenticity there. I don't think he buys into it wholeheartedly. And I don't think I don't think David felt he was equipped to sort of analyze what the results would be. There's very little politics in a certain way in that piece at all. I mean, not politics of the sort most people would write. Just as the Federer piece is not a typical profile, the piece on John McCain, you know, and I think it was in Rolling Stone that it ran too, which, you know, would be an unusual place to write about an essentially conservative political figure. A lot of people were angry with David afterward and felt he'd sort of let McCain off for, you know, for having an appealing person, a personality that appealed to David without actually having politics that would appeal to David.
Well, David wasn't alone. I mean, McCain had a way of charming journalists, even skeptical and cynical journalists. I'm curious, you know, there was this, Jonathan Franzen wrote a New Yorker piece, and I wouldn't say he theorized this explicitly, but he kind of there's a phrase in there, suicide is career move. And he kind of doesn't rule that out. And I was talking to my wife about this, and I was like, I said, well, on the one hand, obviously, when you kill yourself, you're depressed and things seem hopeless, and that is that proximate cause. On the other hand, if you had suicidal tendencies as long as him, you've done the scenario problem. You've thought about it. You've probably thought about the aftermath. You've probably thought about, how would people react? Will you be canonized and so on? I'm just wondering how that phrase struck you or that prospect strikes you.
I mean, I'm not John. He'd be a better person to tell you exactly what he meant by it. But I think it's correct that during all those long years of depression that David thought about the tradition of suicide in literature, the Sylvia Plaths and so on. I don't think that was foremost on his mind at the very end, God knows. But was it present over his life? I would certainly think it would have to have been. He was very aware of that kind of thing in general. I don't think, again, you have to ask John, I don't think he was saying that David committed suicide to help lift sales of Infinite Jest. I think maybe what he might be suggesting is that it then fits David into a kind of paradigm that we can all, understand and connect to. Oh, brilliant author commits suicide, leaves.
And it does.
Works. But again, I'm speculating. I mean, John would be the best person to explain that sentence.
Well, it's a kind of ambiguous passage, and it's probably meant that way. But
I think that's right.
And it does influence your legacy. I mean, that movie almost certainly would not have been made we would not be having this conversation. Had he not killed himself.
As a ghost story would have been written. First of all,
right.
Certainly would have been written, now because he would have been alive and he wouldn't have been the kind of person you write a biography of a living writer is itself extremely difficult. And we'd have been anticipating later work that would significantly change or could significantly change any biography of David. So I think that's true. And then the suicide put David front and center in the world in a way that he wasn't. He was, I think, look, David always had his fans. And Infinite Jest always was a book that you could find on campus among the very smartest of a certain kind of reader. Always. So, I mean, the history of Infinite Jest, huge publishing push, becomes the book of the year, 1996. And
in literary circles, you mean? It's like in highbrow fiction circles. This is
even beyond that. I mean, it's beyond highbrow fiction. It's not. I mean, it's not. I'm trying to think of kind of it's not Shades of Grey, right?
But that's not considered highbrow fiction. I mean,
in terms of its reach in the culture,
yeah,
I think it's too limited to say that it only reached highbrow readers. It may have only been finished by highbrow readers. But it became the kind of independent bookstore book of the year. I don't know. It's a little hard.
Something you want on your coffee table.
Well, even beyond that, I mean, something people have the ambition to read. What would be comparable? Maybe the only comparable books would be Franzen's books lately.
Yeah.
Although it's a harder book than John's.
In nonfiction, it would be Gerdel or Bach, I think. If you remember.
Yes, I think that's right. That's a very long ago.
But it's like it's on everyone's coffee table. No one's finished it. They should. Now, although, as you said, there was a following that definitely totally finished his books, mainly male, I think, young, smart.
Right. Often, yeah. Well, all I was going to say is that, so the book kind of, look, any book that has a success begins to subside. That's an almost standard experience. And yet it never disappears. And so, 10 years after, which is historically sort of a trough for most books of the year. If you went and looked at how many copies In the Name of the Rose sold 10 years later, or Gödel Escherbach, there's dozens of these books. I think you'd find, to your shock, how few they were selling, and that might even be out of print, and certainly out of people's minds. That was never the case with David. He was continuing to produce work, interesting work, not work that easily sort of connected to Infinite Jest. So he writes a collection of short stories called Brief Interviews with Hideous Men that explores just the kind of state of self-dislike that he was so prone to. And then he writes, he does a good deal of nonfiction. In a way, becomes better known for his nonfiction and more sought after. But he's always thinking of himself as a fiction writer. And he's working on a book that's only published posthumously called The Pale King, which is about some tax accountants in the Midwest.
And was never really finished by him.
Oh,
Right?
not finished at all. So when he dies, look, when he dies, it's, if you ask a certain kind of person, it was the worst day of their life since, whatever, right? Since Kurt Cobain. And there are a lot of those people. And even allowing for the idea that people sort of they ramp up their memories of that moment sort of after the fact. It was a big moment. And I think it was actually a surprisingly big moment. I think it was a moment for a lot of younger, serious readers where they were surprised at how committed they were to Wallace, given that they weren't really spending a ton of time thinking about him day to day. And that's really where I think so you could say, well, was that the suicide and the tragedy of the early death that was the thought of the books that he wouldn't live to write? I mean, these were all a part of it. Or was it just a kind of, I would argue that he had made enough of a mark as a kind of positive presence in the psyches of certain kinds of people that when he died, they missed him. Mm-hmm. The way, not just for the current books, but for the whole thing that we're talking about.
Mm-hmm. And final question, in terms of his literary reputation, leaving aside the question of whether it will be a larger reputation than it might have been if he hadn't committed suicide, it might have been a less large one because who knows what it might have been a larger one if he hadn't committed suicide because who knows what he would have gone on to produce. But
right.
What do you think he'll be remembered for? I mean, is there an innovation or a school of writing that, he's most closely associated with and is considered a leader of, or what?
Yeah, look, I think it's, when people say, well, he'll be read 50 years from now, I don't dare to put my toe in that water. Will there be readers 50 years from now? Will there, or will the North Koreans successfully launch one of their nuclear weapons or carry it on their backs or whatever? Like, we can't know these things, seriously. But I think if you assume that culture continues and that literary culture in some form continues, I think you look to David for, I would say, a kind of millennial novel that admits to all the doubts that people are feeling in a way that hadn't previously been done. A novel that's sort of subsequently open to emotion but skeptical of emotion. I'm speaking mostly of Infinite Jest. A novel that acknowledges the kind of massive damage that America inflicts on its own people, but at the same time a novel with this sort of curious kind of faith component that we hadn't seen in fiction in years. I mean, for David, faith is really in his 12-step programs, but it's not always read that way. And from a formal point of view, it's, I don't know that the formal is the most interesting, but it birthed a generation of self-aware writers. There's almost it may be a little bit now that we're getting the reaction to that, but it changed the way, hundreds of thousands of people thought about sentences and how to write and how that, especially essays, the first person emerging into the essay, the sense of the I. I'm teaching now at Princeton, as we talked about before we started this conversation, and you can still feel the presence of David Foster Wallace in the way that the first person is reintroduced into nonfiction.
Okay.
Well, you don't put that on somebody's gravestone, but that's a way of saying he changed how people think about writing in the South.
Right. Okay, well, listen, thank you so much, Daniel, for taking the time. The book, again, is Every Love Story is a Ghost Story, A Life of David Foster Wallace by D.T. Max, which is you. And really appreciate it. And I will let you get back to teaching now.
All right, so thanks for the conversation.
Okay, thank you.